Lecture 13, Part 1, International Politics. With respect to law, national politics greatly differs from international politics. A nation-state is internally governed by enforceable laws. Violation of these laws may even be grounds for expulsion from the state and the consequent loss of citizenship. In contrast, in the world of international politics, the enforceability of agreed-upon international law is considerably less, since there isn't a body that stands above all nations with powers to establish, execute, and enforce laws. Perhaps this absence is best. Lord Acton probably would think so. He held, as mentioned in a previous chapter, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, his own words. Could the same be said about a powerful supernatural entity that had the power to make, execute, and enforce law for all nations? Many politicians think so. For this reason, there is not a concerted effort to form a supranational entity that all states will be accountable to. Its absence is reflected by the fact that many international laws are governed only by consent, that is, by agreement. This means that if a state has not agreed to abide by these international laws, then, generally speaking, it is not obliged to. What do you think? Do you think there should be a strong world political authority? Do you think the United Nations with the relatively weak political authority is even too much? Do you stand somewhere in the middle between these two views? Perhaps you think the UN could serve, but in order for it to do so, it needs to be changed structurally. A moral world political power? Pope Benedict XVI, in his 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate, seems to advocate a world political power that has real teeth, unlike the current UN. And I want to read an excerpt from this encyclical 2009. And he says this: in the face of the unrelenting growth of global interdependence, there is a strongly felt need, even in the midst of a global recession, for a reform of the United Nations organization, and likewise of economic institutions and international finance, so the concept of family of nations can acquire real teeth. One also senses the urgent need to find innovative ways of implementing the principle of the responsibility to protect and of giving poor nations an effective voice in the shared decision-making. This seems necessary in order to arrive at a political, juridical, and economic order which can increase and give direction to international cooperation for the development of all peoples in solidarity. To manage the global economy, to revive economies hit by the crisis, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and the great imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment and to regulate migration. For all this, there is urgent need of a true world political authority, as my predecessor, Blessed John the 23rd, indicated some years ago. Such an authority would need to be regulated by law, to observe consistently the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, to seek to establish the common good, and to make a commitment to securing authentic integral human development inspired by the values of charity and truth. Furthermore, such an authority would need to be universally recognized and to be vested with the effective power to ensure security for all, regard for justice, and respect for rights. Obviously, it would have to have the authority to ensure compliance with its decisions from all parties, and also with the coordinated measures adopted in various international forums. Without this, despite the great progress accomplished in various sectors, international law would risk being conditioned by the balance of power among the strongest nations. The integral development of peoples and international cooperation require the establishment of a greater degree of international ordering, marked by subsidiarity, for the management of globalization. They also require the construction of a social order that at last conforms to the moral order, to the interconnection between moral and social spheres, and to the link between politics and the economic and civil spheres as envisioned by the Charter of the United Nations." End of quote. Morgenthau: a world moral political power is impossible. Remember the founder of political realism, Hans Morgenthau, whom you were introduced to in a previous chapter? Morgenthau rejected the notion that morality exists in the world of international politics. According to him, When a statesman is thinking in terms of international politics, he must think in terms of the national interest, conceived as power among other powers. I'm quoting from him. The popular mind, unaware of the fine distinction of the statesman thinking, reasons more often than not in the simple moralistic and legalistic terms of absolute good and absolute evil. End of quote. To what extent do you agree with Morgenthau or disagree, and why? Dorothy Day, mutual aid, not competition. Who is Dorothy Day, and how is she relevant for our discussion on international politics? The American Benedictine Oblate Dorothy Day is currently considered by the Catholic Church a servant of God after her cause for canonization was officially approved. She was a noted social activist, a great defender of the poor, and a convert to Catholicism from atheism. Prior to her conversion, she was deeply concerned for the poor. The Russian economist, and of course after her conversion, she became even more concerned for the poor due to her embracing of Catholicism. The Russian economist, evolutionary theorist, anarchist, and social activist Peter Kropotkin had an interesting influence on Dorothy Day's thought. Kropotkin disagreed with Darwin's thesis that competition is at the basis for the survival of a species. To survive, animals do not primarily ruthlessly compete, argued Kropotkin, but instead naturally band together to defend and support each other. Since Kropotkin identified himself with anarchism, he was opposed to the formation of a strong world political power. However, his ideas differ from Morgenthau's assumption that competition and survival are at the essence of international politics. Rather, according to Kropotkin, what is most basic is collaboration and cooperation even on the international level. In defending his thesis that mutual aid and not competition are the most basic principles, he argues, and I'm going to quote from him, "Don't compete. Competition is always injurious to the species, and you have plenty of resources to avoid it. That is the tendency of nature, not always realized in full, but always present. That is the watchword which comes to us from the bush, the forest, the river, the ocean. Therefore, combine, practice mutual aid. That is the surest means for giving to each and to all the greatest safety, the best guarantee of existence and progress, bodily, intellectual, and moral. That is what nature teaches us, and that is what all those animals which have attained the highest position in the respective classes have done. That is also what man, the most primitive man, has been doing. And that is why man has reached the position upon which we stand now, as we shall see in subsequent chapters devoted to mutual aid in human societies." End of quote. Kropotkin's thesis seems to be in part verified by anthropological data, including fossil evidence, at least as presented by the U.S. anthropologist Agustin Fuentes. According to Fuentes, warfare in human history is atypical, whereas human cooperation, mutual aid, and compassion are typical, that is, much more common. One reason why this was and is the case, argues Fuentes, is that to survive amidst terrifying creatures, such as monstrously large hyenas, human beings banded together and learned to survive socially, communally. Fossil records indicate that social cooperation existed among our ancient ancestors to a degree that surpasses any other species. And then, of course, from the perspective of faith, we are socially, being social is much more important than just fighting among each other individually, because we're made in the image and likeness of the Trinity. And God is one divine nature in three persons, a communion of persons in one divine nature. Hard power or soft power. As mentioned before in a previous lecture, political power, both internationally and domestically, has been categorized as hard and soft. Coercive hard political power is primarily determined by a nation's military as coupled with its political and economic influence. Soft power, it refers to persuasive and non-coercive diplomatic means that a nation employs to achieve desired political ends. In arguing for the greater use of soft power, Joseph S. Nye first rejects Machiavelli's view that, I quote, "it is better to be feared than loved," According to Nye, in contrast, in today's world it's best to be both, and I'm quoting him. Winning hearts and minds has always been important, but it is even more so in a global information age. Information is power, and modern information technology is spreading information more widely than ever before in history. Yet political leaders have spent little time thinking about how the nature of power had changed, and more specifically, about how to incorporate the soft dimensions into their strategies for wielding power. In defining soft power, a term Nye coined, he writes, and I quote, "It is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payments. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideals, and policies. When our policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others, our soft power is enhanced. When you get others to admire your ideals and to want what you want, you do not have to spend as much on sticks and carrots to move them in your direction. Seduction is always more effective than coercion, and many values like democracy, human rights, and individual opportunities are deeply seductive." End of quote. What are your thoughts on Nye's promotion of soft power, or even definition of what soft power consists of? Even though I do not like his use of the concept seduction due to its association with immoral intent, I agree with his emphasis on soft power over hard power. One reason I agree is very practical. Use of soft power to achieve political ends will entail, borrowing an idea from Chalmers Johnson, less risk of political blowback. Political blowback, defines Johnson, refers to the, and I quote him, refers to the unintended consequences of policies that were kept secret from American people. What the daily press reports as the malign acts of terrorists or drug lords or rogue states or illegal arms merchants often turns out to be blowback from earlier American operations. In backing up his claim, Johnson cites many examples, including the Lockerbie bombings. According to Johnson, it is now widely recognized, for example, that the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which resulted in the deaths of 259 passengers and 11 people on the ground, was retaliation for a 1986 Reagan administration aerial raid on Libya that killed President Gaddafi's stepdaughter. End of quote. As pointed out by Seth Freeman, the failed attempt to use soft power in the form of negotiation by the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain when supposedly appeasing Adolf Hitler in 1938 is referred to dismiss soft power in favor of hard power tactics. While acknowledging that soft power tactic of negotiation has its limits and can set the stage for disaster if used poorly, Freeman defends the power of negotiation with reference to the West Point U.S. Military Academy's program of teaching cadets negotiation techniques when dealing with enemy combatants on the field, and the highly successful New York Police Department's hostage negotiation team techniques when dealing with hostage takers. Tactics include establishing trust, active listening, learning how to say no in a diffusive manner, and finding ways to talk with hostage takers, since, and I quote, "the longer you talk with the hostage taker, the less chance he'll do something violent, and the greater chance things will end peacefully." God bless.